Hello and welcome to the Codcast from Commonwealth Magazine. I'm Michael Jonas. Governor Charlie Baker signed a big criminal justice bill this month. Most of the changes are geared toward easing the heavy hand the system applies to offenders and toward helping them get back on their feet and hopefully stay out of jail. The bill has received widespread but not universal praise. Along with lightening some sanctions and removing mandatory minimum sentences for some drug offenses, the bill also introduces new mandatory minimum sentences related to the synthetic opioids fentanyl and carfentanil. That drew a sharp rebuke from Setti Warren, the former mayor of Newton and one of 3 Democrats running for governor. Warren said he would have vetoed the bill because of the new mandatory minimum provisions. Now, that in turn drew a fairly sharp rebuke from Senator Will Brownsberger, co-chairman of the legislature's Judiciary Committee and one of the lead sponsors of the bill. He called the position uninformed and said after Warren issued the statement that he decided to endorse one of his rivals for the Democratic nomination, Jay Gonzalez. Well, we aim to convene the conversation on important issues facing the Commonwealth, and so are happy to have Setti Warren and Will Brownsberger here for today's installment of the Codcast. Setti Warren, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
And Will Brownsberger, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here all together.
And so there's a sort of political dimension and a policy dimension, I guess, to this. And, we're more focused on policy here at Commonwealth. And so, let's start out at least with a look at the policy issues here at stake. And so we'll sort of make the case for the new provisions in the bill that seem to sort of go against the main thrust of it, which is, as I said, sort of lightening the load and removing some mandatory minimums. Why add these new mandatory minimum sentences related to these drugs?
Well, so first of all, this is a bill, I think that you said it, but it really goes soup to nuts across the criminal justice system from the beginning to the end, from what's a crime to the issue of diversion, to bail, to solitary confinement, to compassionate release, to all the things that happen to people after, fees, fines, CORI, whole host of dimensions that are about lifting people up instead of locking people up. Then there is a group of things that we do to minimum mandatories, which include eliminating the most common, almost eliminating the most common minimum mandatory, which is school zones, eliminating the minimum mandatory, which accounts for the most man years of incarceration, which is the cocaine mandatories. Those cocaine mandatories accounted for more man years of incarceration than all the heroin, Class A trafficking mandatories put together. So in the context of that negotiation, this is not something we started with in our bill, but
right, this ended up in the House version, right?
Yeah, it ended up in the Senate, and there were people pushing it in the Senate as well to create to take the existing fentanyl offense and make it a mandatory offense. Is that going to have an impact on incarceration? It may have some impact on incarceration, but you set it up next to all the other changes we're making. In the context of a bill where you have to get support, you accept it because you know that even just focusing on the minimum mandatories, you're doing a lot to reduce incarceration. Never mind everything else in the bill, but let's just narrow it to drug minimum mandatories. The net is a significant reduction in incarceration. I want to be careful there, by the way, that nobody really knows how those numbers are going to work. Someone would argue that, look, judges aren't really going to do anything that different anyway, because they take these crimes seriously. You take away the mandatory, they're still going to send people. So nobody really knows exactly how much difference eliminating any mandatory will make. But if you look at the current volume, the mandatories we eliminated, net of the couple of mandatories we added, net the impact is less incarceration due to minimum mandatory sentences.
Okay, and so Setti Warren, but this raised a big red flag in your view in terms of the whole bill. Talk a little bit about what was so troublesome to you about these provisions.
Well, first and foremost, I want to acknowledge the incredible amount of work that has been done to get to the point where we're actually reducing certain types of mandatory minimums. I have the utmost respect for the senator who's been working on this for many years, as well as many activists out there and legislators. So my aim here in any way is not to disparage their work or their leadership on this, including the senator here. Let me tell you why I took this position. I know that mandatory minimums are discriminatory. I know that they don't reduce crime, and I know that they don't reduce addiction. on the discrimination end, we know 20% of the people that live in Massachusetts are Black and Latino, yet 73% of the people incarcerated by mandatory minimums are Black and Latino. I've talked to people, I've listened to experts in this field, I've talked to family members who have loved ones who've been incarcerated by mandatory minimums. I also acknowledge, and at the highest levels of government, my former boss, President Bill Clinton, apologized for putting in place these mandatory minimums and supporting them in the 1990s, because he realized, after looking at it, as many others do, that these are discriminatory and they've hurt community colors. Finally, as an African-American male whose father sat at the sit-ins in the 1960s in North Carolina at school, went to jail for civil rights. For me, I look at this and I believe this is a matter of principle. Now, Charlie Baker introduced this new idea of mandatory minimums for fentanyl and carfentanil back in the summer. This new mandatory minimum was included in this bill, and that's why I said I would not sign legislation with new mandatory minimums. As much as we've done great work, or the legislature had done great work in greatly reducing mandatory minimums, I stood very strongly, and I still feel that way as a matter of principle. Introducing new mandatory minimums is a step too far for me. So that's why I said I would veto the legislation.
So is it? Well, when you take away more than you add, how does that work? I mean,
you're asking me that question, honestly.
Yeah, I mean,
look, for me, I'm all for compromise. If I had a bill that came to me that had all the things that you included in there without adding new mandatory minimums, I would sign it. And by the way, for me, this is the difference between having a Democratic progressive governor and not. If I were governor, I don't believe, or I'm hopeful, we would not get Charlie Baker's proposal coming to my desk with new mandatory minimums, because I have
unless
made
maybe
it clear,
he got elected to the legislature and he filed
I would
as
make
a state rep from Swampscott.
Okay, if Charlie was in the legislature, I would have made it clear
Yeah.
that I would not sign a bill with new mandatory minimums in it. So, understanding that the Senate is more progressive than the House, I believe the weight goes towards more progressive Senate with a more progressive Democrat that would not see a bill that included new mandatory minimums. So,
yeah, but I'm sorry, I could finish.
yeah. So from my perspective, again, that's where I draw a line. That's where, for me, I stand by my principles, not adding a new destructive mandatory minimum that have just decimated communities of color. I wouldn't do it.
I don't want this to be about the House or the Senate, one more being progressive than the others, because plenty, or really even me and the governor, because there's lots of people that feel that dealing fentanyl is tantamount to murder, and there is there's a lot of people, hundreds of people dying every month with these new chemicals that really are extraordinarily dangerous. So there's plenty of people in the legislature, Democrats and Republicans, that feel strongly about fentanyl, and so having a minimum mandatory for that, which the fentanyl. The opiate epidemic is white and black. It's not all about black people, dealing this drug or something. That's not what's happening. It's not a racial thing. This is a drug that's killing people all across the board, and so it's not that this is Charlie Baker's thing. It's the thing that came out of the legislature. There were senators who favored it. There was House members who favored it. So this is a compromise product that comes out of the legislature, which net. Shifts resources, shifts enforcement away from the little guy, from their low-level drug dealer, whatever they're selling, onto traffickers, and net reduces incarceration. And I think very likely, whether you were there or Governor Baker was there, this bill would have been on your desk. And then to say, I'm going to veto this, even though it is a net positive bill, even on mandatory minimums, everybody's just sort of shaking their head and saying, what does Setti know that we don't know? I mean, and black, white, Hispanic legislators voted for this. This is not about race. This is about doing something to lift the little guy up, but nonetheless keep a focus on the most dangerous crimes.
I'm all for, by the way, increasing penalties for people in this regard, dealing fentanyl, carfentanil. So as far as punishment is concerned, let's ratchet that up. Where I draw the line is mandatory minimums. I believe very strongly these laws have been so destructive to communities all across the country, in our Commonwealth, communities of color. I'm all for compromise. I mean, I've been a mayor for 8 years. I've compromised on different pieces of ordinance, certainly budgets. I am not going to compromise my principle, knowing what I know and the history behind mandatory minimums, putting people in jail. And that's how I think about this. And frankly, that's the job of a governor, to take a principled stand, introduce that into the legislative process, and not be afraid to have that disagreement with his or her own party.
But the question is, do you think that nobody in the legislature has principles? I mean, do you think everybody?
Not at all.
But
Not at all.
people have the same principles. Many people in the legislature have exactly the same principles
Sure.
that you're announcing.
Yeah.
But they realized that to get what this bill does, they had to work with people. They had to compromise, and that's what came to your desk. And at that point, I don't understand it. But I mean, are you against all mandatory minimums?
Yes.
So drunk driving?
I'm against all mandatory minimums. They don't
Drunk
work.
driving for you're against
I'm
mandatory
against
minimums
all
for
mandatory minimums, Senator. I said it.
Well, let's just check it out. So mandatory
All
minimums for
mandatory
murder?
minimums. I am against mandatory minimums.
For murder?
I don't believe in them. I believe in
For any crime? How about owning a machine
I
gun?
don't believe in mandatory minimums.
So assault weapons?
You heard. I've answered the question.
So it's assault weapons, drunk driving, child molestation, no matter what, you're against mandatory minimums.
I'm against mandatory minimums.
Okay.
They're destructive. What we should do is ensure that the penalties for these crimes are high, and ensure that judges are employing their responsibility and putting people behind bars that don't belong on the streets.
Against
What
mandatory
do I believe?
Against
Yes.
mandatory
Yes.
minimums for shooting police officers.
Again, I'm against mandatory minimums.
For all those crimes.
Again, I'm against mandatory minimums.
So we heard
But
it
I
for all
wanna-
those crimes.
I
Okay.
I just want to be clear. They don't work. We know that. I'm against I want to make sure we have strict penalties in place. But I also believe here, as a matter of principle, we need to have a chief executive that's willing to push back and change the way what's happening, some of the things that haven't been happening on Beacon Hill. I mean, one of the areas I'm most concerned about, for example, is the state police. I don't think it's a problem for the governor, for me, certainly as a governor, to ask the legislature to put in place an independent commission to review the oversight and management of the state police. I asked the legislature to do that because it hasn't been happening. That's the responsibility for the governor. It's from my perspective, I don't think there's anything wrong with the governor challenging the status quo when needed. And it doesn't mean that I'm accusing a legislator of not having a principle. It just means that I believe there needs to be a chief executive with principle and leadership. Mm-hmm. The budget process right now, we've got another example. I sent a letter to the governor and the Senate president, the House Speaker last year to put honesty and transparency in the budget process. We got a budget downgrade downgrading of the bond rating, the state of Standard & Poor's, first time in 30 years. I made a proposal to have a level service maintenance budget presented, 5-year revenue projections. I believe the job of a chief executive is to work towards principle where they see it, make sure we're doing that they believe that the state's doing the right thing for the people of the state of Massachusetts in this regard. And I don't see any problem when a governor says they disagrees with members of their own party, whether it's in mandatory minimums or whether it's on budgeting, whether it's the state police.
And Will, just on this question, I'm curious. I mean, as you've said, and I think Setti have both said, obviously governing is a matter of compromise and give and take. I mean, was that the case for you? I mean, did you sort of give and take? If you could have waved a magic wand, would these mandatories not be in there? They weren't your idea,
They
wouldn't.
They weren't my idea,
and they wouldn't be there. And you can understand that people say the bill does kind of seem to send a mixed message, and there's been a strong feeling that particularly nonviolent drug offense mandatory minimums. As Setti says, and the Chief Justice Gantz has been very outspoken about the racial disparities in their use, and just the question of, as much as we are horror struck by the opioid epidemic, again, it's not clear that we sort of can incarcerate our way out of it. And so even though there's there may be a natural impulse that, we treat this drug and the sale of it differently than we do cocaine and others because it's so deadly, is that sort of jail-focused approach going to necessarily work? Or again, as I said, you wouldn't have had it in there if you could have written the whole bill, right?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't, but I
Right.
did include making fentanyl a Class A drug, and so folding it into the trafficking structure for heroin. Because if you're going to have any mandatory minimums, fentanyl better be one of them. But I mean, I sort of come back to it. I mean, if this is you just have to look at it in a larger context. If this is principle matters, but numbers matter. I mean, you're taking away the most common mandatory minimums. You're going to touch the lives of thousands of defendants every year, and these relatively niche mandatory minimums you're making an issue out of. So it's just not really rational. But I mean, as governor, if this is a matter of principle, would you be filing legislation to repeal all mandatory minimums? I mean,
Yeah.
Okay, so you would file legislation to repeal gun mandatories.
I don't believe in mandatory minimums.
So you would file legislation to repeal them all.
I don't believe in mandatory minimums.
And you said you would, right?
So Setti, one sort of
I've answered the question.
One sort of procedural question that I know a lot of people have raised is that the governor can send back a bill with amendments. So people have said, why would you have not sent it back and basically, strike those provisions from it? And I get, if I'm right, to return them, would that require a 2/3 vote to reinstate them?
Well, let's see. I mean, you return you don't return the individual item. You return the whole bill.
Yeah.
With suggestions, and then I guess it's just a majority vote as to whether you want to accept those suggestions, and then I guess the governor can then veto it without the suggestions and override it. It gets a little.
Right.
It gets. How you
Right.
play that through gets a little confusing,
but it seems like eventually you could have gotten to the point where you kind of force a isolated vote on these provisions, and then we could have seen, I guess, it sort of separates the wheat from the chaff. Is there really support, for these provisions? And I would imagine a lot of your progressive colleagues would have voted against it if there was a separate vote.
No, but
that could have been
we did.
made on these.
We did, right?
provisions.
We had these votes in the Senate, and a majority of senators, me included, voted against some of these things that would have added new mandatory
Right.
minimums. I'm not sure the vote was exactly the same as what was
Okay.
ultimately in the House, but yeah, we
Right.
voted. We had opportunities to vote against mandatory minimums, and the Senate did.
Mm-hmm.
But then everybody who then did that voted for the whole bill
Right.
because they know
Right.
that you have to take a little bit of bad with all that good.
And so I guess back to the question, what about this idea of having not vetoed the whole bill, but this process of returning it with amendments?
So I believe the job of a chief executive in this regard is to be very clear about principle. The legislature has a job. The governor has a job. What's the role of a leader? Where does that leader draw principle in line? Again, we know mandatory minimums are discriminatory. We know they don't work. We know they have incarcerated thousands of people that shouldn't be in jail. For me, this is exactly what the job of a chief executive is to be very clear that they would veto this legislation if it came to their desk and to drive policy. That is what I believe the job is. And again, I don't think there's any problem with having a disagreement over policy with your fellow Democrats. I mean, I don't think that that's an issue. I think at times that is needed. And this is a time when you're adding new mandatory minimums. Again, there are things in the bill that I actually wish were there, and I would have signed it. One of which is raising the juvenile age for crime to 18, 19. That wasn't in.
If that was in,
And so-
but if that was in with the minimum mandatories, would you then have signed it?
No.
Okay, so no matter what you put in the bill, if there's
yeah,
a single minimum mandatory, you don't sign it.
My point is, compromise is, in fact, I'm all for compromise. I would have signed the bill without putting a new mandatory minimum in place. Senator Brownsberger went through some really great things in that bill about 10 minutes ago, which are excellent, which are going to really move the needle on justice. When you add new mandatory minimums in place, like Charlie Baker proposed and was included in this bill, that's where a governor needs to draw the line. And that's the difference between having a Democrat, I believe, in that corner office and Charlie Baker. That's my belief. And if, as the senator mentioned, I made that clear to the legislature and they sent me a bill with new mandatory minimums, Charlie Baker wasn't in the legislature from Swampscott, I would veto it. I would not sign it. And I asked them to send it back to me without the thing in there. If they overrode me with 2/3, then, so be it. But that's the job of a governor. At certain times, we compromise. A chief executive should compromise. But on principles, I believe a governor needs to drive policy in that principle. And that's we respectfully disagree, Senator. I know.
No, but what is a compromise if you don't compromise principles? I mean, every compromise means compromising principles.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
I mean, that's what you always have to do.
One of my principles, as I said in the illustration of this bill, I would have liked to see all mandatory minimums gone, but that we reduced, and you did some great things in the bill. You didn't do some of the things I would have wanted, like the raising the age to 19. But I would have signed that bill if in fact you didn't include Charlie Baker's new mandatory minimums. I would have signed that bill. So that to me is compromise. At a certain point, a leader has to draw a line in the sand. Adding a new mandatory minimum, Governor Baker's proposal, is where we need to stop the madness of incarceration. Why are we adding a new one? It's wrong. That's what I believe. We respectfully disagree.
We do.
All right. Well, I think that's where we'll then leave it. And I want to thank both of you for coming in for today's installment of the podcast. Setti Warren, thanks so much for coming in. And Will Brownsberger, thanks to you. You've been listening to another installment of the podcast from Commonwealth Magazine. I'm Michael Jonas. Listen to us every week here. Subscribe on SoundCloud or iTunes. Thanks again for listening.